Good evening, friends. This is Shana again, ready to read you your bedtime story from Porter Square Books. Tonight I thought I would read from one of my favorite fairy tale retellings because I was thinking about them a lot yesterday, since fairy tales are something I shared with my mom a lot. When I was little, we read so many various versions of them. So I'm going to be reading from Robin McKinley's Spindle's End. If you are interested in purchasing it, you can go to the Porter Square Books website. And yeah, it's a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, and Robin McKinley is great. So, Spindle's End, Part 1. Chapter 1. The magic in that country was so thick and tenacious that it settled over the land like chalk dust, and over floors and shelves like slightly sticky plaster dust. House cleaners in that country earned unusually good wages. If you lived in that country, you had to descale your kettle of its incrustation of magic at least once a week, because if you didn't, you might find yourself pouring hissing snakes or pond slime into your teapot instead of water. It didn't have to be anything scary or unpleasant like snakes or slime, especially in cheerful households. Magic tended to reflect the atmosphere of the place in which it found itself. But if you want a cup of tea, a cup of lavender and gold pansies or ivory thimbles is unsatisfactory. And while the pansies, put dry in a vase, would probably last a day looking like ordinary pansies before they went grayish dun and collapsed into magic dust, something like an ivory thimble would begin to smudge and crumple as soon as you picked it up. The best way to do it was to have a fairy as a member of your household, because it was usually a she, could lay a finger on the kettle just as it came to boil. Absent-minded fairies could often be recognized by the pad of scar tissue on the finger they favored for kettle cleaning, and murmur a few counter-magical words. There would be a tiny inaudible "fuck," like a seed pod bursting, and the water would stay water for another week, or maybe 10 days. Demagicking a kettle was much too little and fussy and frequent a job for any professional fairy to be willing to be hired to do it, so if you weren't related to one, you had to dig up a root of the deja vine and dry it and grate it, producing a white powder rather like plaster dust or magic, and add a pinch of that to your kettle once a week. More often than that would give everyone in the household cramps. You could tell the households that didn't have a fairy by the deja vines growing over them. Possibly because they were always having their roots disturbed, dejas developed a reputation for being tricky to grow and prone to sudden collapse. Fortunately, they rerooted easily from cuttings. "She'd give me her last deja root," was a common saying about a good friend. People either loved that country and couldn't imagine living anywhere else, or hated it, left it as soon as they could, and never came back. If you loved it, you loved coming over the last hill before your village one day in early autumn and hearing the cornfields singing madrigals, and that day became a story you told your grandchildren, the way in other countries other grandparents told the story of the day they won the betting pool at the pub, or their apple cakes won first place at the local fete. If you lived there, you learned what you had to do, like putting a pinch of dried deja vine in your kettle once a week, like asking your loaf of bread to remain a loaf of bread before you struck it with a knife. The people of this country had developed a reputation among outsiders for being unusually pious because of the number of things they appeared to mutter a blessing over before they did them. But in most cases, this was merely the asking of things it was safer to ask to remain non-magical first, while work or play or food preparation or whatever was being got on with. No one had ever heard of a loaf of bread turning into a flock of starlings for anyone they knew, but the nursery tale was well known, and in that country it didn't pay to take chances. The muttered words were usually only some phrases such as "bread, stay bread," or in upper-class households, "bread, please oblige me," which is a less wise form, since an especially impish gust of magic could choose to translate oblige just as it chose. Births were very closely attended, because the request that things stay what they were had to be gotten in quickly, birth being a very great magic, and in that country likely to be teased into mischief. It was so common an occurrence as to occasion no remark when a new sown field began coming up, quite obviously as something other than what it was planted, and by a week later to have reverted to what the farmer had put in. But while, like the pansies and the thimbles, this kind of magic was only a temporary aberration, it could be very embarrassing and onerous while it lasted. Farmers in that country worried more about falling asleep during the birthing times of their stock than they worried about the weather. The destruction of a litter of baby Terrellians caused remained, even the destruction of a litter of baby Terrellians caused remained, even after it had reverted to piglets. No one knew how the wild birds and beasts negotiated this, but human parents-to-be would go to extreme lengths to ensure a fairy was on hand to say the birth words over their new little one. Generally speaking, the more mobile and water-dependent something was, the more likely magic was to get at it. This meant animals, and of course humans, were the most vulnerable. Rocks were pretty reliably rocks, except, of course, when they were something else that had been turned into rocks. The rocks themselves sort of slept through magic attacks, and even if some especially wild and erratic bit of magic decided to deck out a dry stone wall as a marble fountain, you could still see the dry stone wall if you closed your eyes and touched the fountain, and the water would not make you wet. The lichen that grew on the rock, however, could be turned into daisies quite convincing enough to make you sneeze, if real daisies did so, and the insects and small creatures that crept over the lichen were more susceptible yet. There was an idea much beloved and written about by this country's philosophers that magic had to do with negotiating the balance between earth and air and water, which is to say that things with legs or wings were out of balance with their earth element by walking around on feet, or worse, flying above the earth in the thin substance of air, obviously entirely unsuitable for the support of solid flesh. The momentum all this inappropriate motion set up in their liquid element unbalanced them further. Spirit in this system was equated with the fourth element, fire. All this was generally felt to be a load of rubbish among the people who had to work in the ordinary world for a living, unlike philosophers living in academies. But it was true that a favorite magical trick at fetes was for theatrically minded fairies to throw bits of chaff or seed pods or conchers into the air and turn them into things before they struck the ground, and the trick worked better if the bits of chaff or seed pods or conchers were wet. Slower creatures were less susceptible to the whims of wild magic than faster creatures, and creatures that flew were the most susceptible of all. Every sparrow had a delicious memory of having once been a hawk, and while magic didn't take much interest in caterpillars, butterflies spent so much time being magic that it was a rare event to see ordinary butterflies without at least an extra set of wings, or a few extra frills and iridescence, or bodies like tiny human beings dressed in flower petals. Fish, which flew through that most dangerous element, water, were believed not to exist. Fishy-looking beings in pools or streams were either hallucinations or other things under some kind of spell. Interfering with, catching, or most especially eating fish was strictly forbidden. All swimming was considered magical. Animals seen doing it were assumed to be favorites of local water sprite or dangerously insane. Humans never tried. There did seem to be one positive effect to living involuntarily steeped in magic. Everyone lived longer. More humans made their century than didn't. Birds and animals often lived to 30, and 50 was not unheard of. The breeders of domestic animals in that country were unusually sober and responsible individuals, since any mistakes they might make would be around to haunt them for a long time. Although magic was ubiquitous and magic workers crucially necessary, the attitude of the ordinary people towards magic and its manipulators was that it, and they, were more than a bit chancy and not to be relied on, however fond you were of your aunt or your next-door neighbor. No one had ever seen a fairy turn into an eagle and fly up above the trees, but there were nursery tales about that too, and it was difficult not to believe that it or sometimes even more unnerving, or something even more unnerving was somehow likely. Didn't farmers grow more stolid and earthy over a lifetime of farming? Wasn't it likely that a lifetime of handling magic made you wilder and more capricious? It was a fact much noticed but rarely discussed, and never in any fairy's hearing, that while fairies rarely married, or, married or not, had children, there never seemed to be any fewer fairies around, generation after generation. So presumably magic ran in the blood of the people the way it ran in all other watery liquids, and sometimes there was enough of it to make someone a fairy, and sometimes there was not. One of the things ordinary people did not like to contemplate was how many people there might be who were, or could have been, fairies, and were masquerading as ordinary people by the simple process of never doing any magic when anyone was around to notice. But there was this very strong tradition that the rulers of this country must be utterly without magic, for rulers must be reliable. They must be the earth and rock underfoot for their people, and if any children of that country's rulers had ever been born fairies, there was not only no official history of it, there were not even any stories about it. This did mean that when the eldest child of each generation of the ruling family came to the age to be married, and, just to be safe, his or her next younger and perhaps next younger after that siblings, there was a great search and examination of possible candidates in terms of their magiclessness first, and their honesty, integrity, intelligence, and so on second. The likelihood of their getting along comfortably with their potential future spouses barely rated a mention on the counselor's list. So far as the country's history extended, which was a little over 1,000 years at the time of this story, the system had worked. And while there were stories of the thick net of anti-magic the court magicians set up for even the cleanest, most magic antipathic betrothed to go through, well, it worked, didn't it? And that was all that mattered. The present king was not only an only child, but had had a very difficult time indeed, or his counselors had, finding a suitable wife. She was not even a princess, finally, but a mere countess of some obscure little backwater country, which, so far as it was known for anything, was known for the fleet hounds its king and queen bred. But she was quiet, dutiful, and so far as any of the cleverest magicians in the land could tell, entirely without magic. Everyone breathed a deep sigh of relief when the wedding was over. It had been a wait of nearly a decade since the king came of marriageable age. But the years passed, and she bore no children. Certain of the king's cousins began to hang around court more than they used to. His generation was particularly rich in cousins, and one or two of those quietly divorced spouses who were insufficiently non-magical. There had not been a break in the line from parent to child in the ruling of the country for over 500 years, and the rule about how the crown passed sideways or diagonally were not clear. Neither the king nor the queen noticed any of this, for they so badly wanted a child that they could not bear to think about the results if they did not. But the counselors noticed, and the king's cousins who divorced their spouses did themselves no good thereby. Nearly 15 years after the king's marriage, the queen was seen suddenly to become rather pale and sickly. Her husband's people, who had become very fond of her, because she was always willing to appear at fairs and festivals and smile during boring speeches, and to kiss the babies, even the grubby and unattractive ones, which were thrust at her, were torn between hoping that whatever she had would kill her off while the king was young enough to remarry, and there was a whole new crop of princesses grown up to marriageable age outside the borders, as well as a few within, and hoping she would get well and come to the fairs and festivals and kiss more babies. The givers of boring speeches especially wished this. She was the best audience they ever had. The truth never occurred to anyone, not even when she began to wear loose gowns and walk more heavily than she used to, because there had been no announcement. The king knew, and her chief waiting woman knew, and the fairy who disguised the queen's belly knew. But the fairy had warned the king and queen that the disguise would go only so far and no further. The baby must be allowed to grow unmolested by tight laces, and the queen's balance must not be deranged by high-heeled shoes. "A magician might make you a proper disguise," said the fairy, whose name was Sigil, "and let you dance all night in a sheath of silk no bigger around than your waist used to be, but I wouldn't advise it. Magicians know everything about magic and nothing about babies. I don't know nearly as much about magic as they do, but I know a lot about babies." Sigil had been with the king's family since the king's mother had been queen, and the king loved her dearly, and his queen had found in her first friend when she came to her husband's court, when she badly needed a friend. And so it was to Sigil the queen went, as soon as she knew for sure that she was pregnant, and begged for a disguise. Seeing that she had longed for a child for so many years, she thought she could not bear the weight of the watchfulness of her husband's people, who longed for this child all these years too, if her pregnancy was announced. The king, who wanted to declare a public holiday, was disappointed, but Sigil sided with the queen. The poor queen could not bring herself, after all the long childless years, to believe it when her friend told her that the baby was fine and healthy and would be born without trouble. "Well, my dear, without any more trouble than the birth of babies does cause, and which you, poor thing, will not find will find quite troublesome enough. and so the birth of an heir was not announced until the queen went into labor. The queen would have waited even then till the baby was born, but Sigil said no, that the baby must be born freely into the world, and freely in an heir to a realm meant with its people waiting to welcome it. The country that day went into convulsions not unlike those the poor queen was suffering. An heir at last! And no one knew! The courtiers and counselors were offended, and the highest-ranking musicians furious, but their voices were drowned out in the tumult of jubilation from the people. The news traveled more quickly than any mere human messenger could take it, for the horses neighed it, and the trees sang it, and the kettles boiled it, and the dust whispered it. An heir! The king's child is born! We have an heir at last! It was a girl, and the names chosen to be given her on her name day were Casta, Albina, Allegra, Dove, Minerva, Fidelia, Aletta, Blythe, Domina, Delicia, Aurelia, Grace, Isabel, Griselda, Gwyneth, Pearl, Ruby, Coral, Lily, Iris, Briar, Rose. She was healthy, just as Sigil had said she would be, and she was born without any more trouble than the birth of babies cause, which is to say, the queen was aching and exhausted, but not too exhausted to weep for joy when the baby was laid in a line for the throne. When the baby was laid in her arms. The eldest child of the reigning monarch was always next in line for the throne, be it a boy or a girl, but it was usually a boy. There was a deeply entrenched folk myth that a queen held this country together better than a king, because there is a clear-eyed, pragmatic common sense about an unmagical woman that even the most powerful, or rather, especially the most powerful, magic found it difficult to disturb. It was thought that a man was more easily dazzled by pyrotechnics. Whether this was true or not, everyone believed it, including the bad fairies, who therefore spent a lot of time making up charms to ensure the birth of male first children to the royal family. The royal magicians dismantled those charms as quickly as they could, but never quite as quickly as the bad fairies made them up. It was difficult to get any of the charms through the heavy guard laid round the royal family. These charms had to be very highly specific, with the knock-on effect that the third children to a reigning monarch were almost always girls. But the folk myth, plus the tangential effect that firstborn princesses were rare enough to be interesting for no reason other than their rarity, guaranteed that the birth of a future queen was greeted with even greater enthusiasm than the birth of a mere future king. So it was in this case. No one seemed to remember, perhaps because their last queen had been nearly 400 years ago, that the queen had left some unfinished business with a wicked fairy named Pernicia, who had sworn revenge. The princess's name day was going to be the grandest occasion that the country had ever seen, or at least that the oldest citizens could remember. Grander than the king and queen's wedding 16 years ago, grander than the king's parents' wedding almost 50 years ago, and certainly grander than the king's own name day, because he'd been born 18 months after his parents' wedding, and no one had realized he was going to be the only one. The king and queen wanted to invite everyone to the name day. Every one of their people, they felt, should have the opportunity to join them on this day of joy and celebration. They were talked out of this ridiculous idea by their counselors, uncharacteristically in agreement on this particular topic, but with some difficulty. It had been the queen's idea to begin with. Her native country was just about small enough that everyone could be invited to a major royal occasion, although the royal list makers and caterers and spare chair providers would hope that not everyone came, and the king and queen recognized by sight a substantial minority of their subjects. While she found her husband's country rather intimidatingly larger, and it seemed all wrong to her that many of his subjects would never meet their king, in times of great importance she reverted to her upbringing. The king was lucky enough to love his wife, and had been rather struck by her tales of a king and queen who had open court days, when anyone who wished to speak to them could turn up and do so. He thought an open name day a splendid idea. "It will not do," said the counselors and courtiers. The magicians were still nursing their snit about having not been told of the queen's pregnancy, and refused to attend the discussions about the name day. What they were really outraged about, of course, was that a mere fairy had managed to successfully fool them. "You must," said the counselors, have the sort of name day that other countries will send emissaries to. We'll need their good wishes. their favorable memories in 19 or 20 years' time, and you cannot make the sort of fuss that an emissary is going to remember pleasantly if 100,000 or so of your people are milling around the city walls, trampling the fields into mud, and demanding to be fed and housed. This made the king and queen thoughtful, for the king remembered the long, difficult search for his wife, and the queen remembered what a shock it had been when the envoy had presented himself at her father's rather small and shabby castle, and she had to be rushed out of the kitchen where she was boiling sweetmeats and up the back stairs to wash her face and comb her hair and put her best dress on to meet him. He had been eating her sweetmeats with a look of great concentration and contentment, when she had made a stately entrance into the front room, slightly out of breath from having hopped down the corridor on one foot and then the other, pulling on her shoes. She hadn't realized that her sweetmeats, excellent though she knew them to be, would render even a king's envoy happy to wait. A compromise was reached. It was the sort of compromise that made the councillors gnash their teeth, but was the best they had been able to wrest from their suddenly obstinate rulers, who would keep insisting that their beloved daughter belonged to her people. Heralds would be sent out to every village, each and every village, to proclaim at the town centre, which might be anything from the steps of a mayor's house in the larger ones to the town well or watering trough in the smaller, that one person, to be chosen by lot, if the magicians had recovered from their snit, they would provide cheat-proof lots, otherwise Sigil would find fairies to do it, was invited to the princess's name day, and that one person, whoever he or she was, need only present that lot as good earnest of the invitation, to be allowed entry into the royal grounds on name day. The councillors and courtiers could only see the fabulous amount of organizational work, and magicians or no magicians, the infinite amount of cheating that would go on, or at least would try to go on, as a result of this plan. And while the court folk were applying court mores to more ordinary people who wouldn't know a political intrigue if it grew butterfly wings and bit them, it was true that the heralds, who were themselves ordinary people under their livery, tended to let it be known, especially at the smaller villages, at the local pub after the official announcement was made, that the king and queen had wanted to invite everyone, really everyone, and if the person with the royal lot showed up with a friend or two, chances were they'd all get in. That took care of the common citizens, and barring the number and manner of them, that was the easy part. Much harder were the high tables, who would sit near the king or the queen, who would have to make do with a slightly less high table headed by a mere prince or duke or baron, which countries were to be invited and to send emissaries, and whether the fuss made over the emissaries should have more to do with the size and status of the country or the number of unmarried sons in the royal family. But hardest of all was what to do about the fairies. Court magicians were members of the court, and there would be special high tables just for them, where they could compare notes on astrological marvels, cast aspersions on the work of other magicians not present to defend themselves, and be slightly world-weary about the necessity of coming to so superstitious and ridiculous an event as a royal name-day. But fairies were a different kettle of imaginary water beings. Some fairies were nearly as powerful as the magicians, and what they thought and did was much more varied and unpredictable. Magicians had to attend the academy for a number of years, and anyone calling himself a magician, since it was usually a he, had a degree in hippogriff letter to show for it, although no one but another magician would be able to read the invisible writing on it. Magicians could go make earthquakes happen if they wanted to, or a castle go up or down in the night, and a properly drawn-up magician's spell could last a lifetime. Mostly they were hired by powerful people to spy on their powerful neighbors, and to demonstrate their existence, so that their powerful neighbors didn't try anything with their own magicians. Fetes, where the magicians of rival families would be present, were always well attended, because the spectacles were sure to be exceptionally fine. Magicians without a taste for this sort of flash stayed at the academy, or at other academies, pursuing the ultimate secrets of the universe, and philosophies concerning the balance of magic, which were presumably dangerous, which is why academy magicians, tend to have long, somber faces, and to move as if they were waiting for something to leap out at them. But the point was that magicians had rules. Fairies were the wild cards in a country where magic itself was wild. Even the queen was a little hesitant about issuing a blanket invitation to fairies. Several hundred fairies together, let alone several thousand, in one place, were certain to kick up a tremendous dust of magic, and fate only knew what might be the outcome. "But most fairies live in towns and villages, do they not?" said the queen. So they are, in a way, included in the invitations our heralds are carrying. The fact was, no one really knew how many fairies, even how many practicing fairies, there were in the country. The ones people knew about were the ones who lived in the towns and villages with other people and visibly did magic. There were known to be fairies who lived in the woods and desert places, and possibly even in the waters, but they were rarely seen, and it was only assumed that they were fewer than the known ones. There were also, of course, wicked fairies, but there weren't many of them, and they tended to keep a low profile, because they knew they were outnumbered, unless someone angered them, and people tried very, very hard not to anger them. It was the malice of the wicked fairies that gave the good ones a lot of their more remunerative work putting things back to rights. But generally speaking, things could be put back to rights. People were diligently cautious about bad fairies, but they didn't worry about them too much, less than they worried about the weather, for example. A drought that would make the crops fail, or a hard winter that would bring wolves into town. It was actually easier if droughts or hard winters were caused by a bad fairy, because then what you did was very straightforward. You hired a good fairy to fix it. The capriciousness of real weather was beyond everybody, even the united efforts of the Academy, who periodically tried. "I think," said the king slowly, "I think that's not quite enough." The queen sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." There had been relatively little magic in her father's country, and she had never quite adjusted to the omnipresence of magic and of magical practitioners. Magic had its uses, but it made her nervous. Sigil she loved dearly, and she was at least half friends with several of the other fairies strategically employed in the royal household, and the magician she mostly found tiresome, and was rather relieved than otherwise that none of them were at the present speaking to her, because they blamed her for the secrecy of her pregnancy. There was a pause. "What if," said the queen at last, "what if we invited a few fairies to become godmothers to our daughter? We could ask 21 of them, one each for her 21 names, and one each for her 21 for the 21 years of her minority. 21 isn't very many. There will be 82 magicians, and we'll make the fairies seem, wanted and welcome. We can ask Sigil whom to invite." "Fairy godmothers?" said the king dubiously. "We'll have a time getting that past the court council, and the bishop." Sigil had been worrying about the fairies too, and thought that inviting 1 in 20 fairies to be godmothers would be an excellent idea, if they could hedge it round with enough precautions. "No gifts," said the king. "Too controversial." "Oh, godmothers must give gifts," said the queen. "It would be terribly rude to tell them they mustn't give their godchild anything." "The queen's right," said Sigil, "but we can tell them they must be token gifts only, little things to amuse a baby or flatter a baby's parents. Nothing difficult." What she meant, the king and queen both knew, was nothing that would make the princess unduly visible on the ethereal plane. That sort of thing was the province of heroes, who were old enough to choose it and strong or stupid enough to bear it. "And I think we should invite at least one man. Male fairies are underappreciated because almost no one remembers they exist." "You must be the first of the godmothers, dear," said the queen, but Sigil shook her head. No, she said, although regret was clear in her voice. "I thank you most sincerely, but I'm already too bound up in the fortunes of this family to be the best godmother for the new little one. Give her 1 in 20 fresh fairies who will love the tie to the royal family, and it can be quite a useful thing to have a few fairies on your side." The king remembered a time when he was still the prince. One of the assistant chefs in the royal kitchen, who was also a fairy, was addressed by a mushroom, fried in butter, and on its way to being part of a solitary late supper for the king, saying, "Don't let the king eat me, or I'll poison him." There was always a fairy or two in the royal kitchens. The rulers of this country did not use tasters, and while it took the magicians to find out who was responsible for the presence of the mushroom, it was the fairy who saved the king's life. Sigil took the queen's hand in her own. "Let me look after the catering. What do you think the cradle should be hung with? Silk? And what colors? Pink, blue, lavender, gold?" "Gold, I think," said the queen, glad to have the question of fairy godmothers agreed upon, but disappointed and a little hurt that Sigil refused to be one. "Gold and white, maybe a little lavender, and the ribbons should have pink and white rosettes." And that is the first chapter of Robin McKinley's Spindle's End. If you want to read more, feel free to head on to portersquarebooks.com and purchase a copy. It's real good. Ron McKinley does such interesting stuff with fairy tales. I hope you enjoyed it. We will see you again tomorrow night with another story. Have a good evening. Take care of yourselves. Bye.